Welcome to the Power of Reading, a book review program that discusses the latest Catholic books. A book is a dream you hold in your hand. This program is prepared for Radio Maria Nairobi and presented to you by the Daughters of St. Paul.
Hello, dear listeners, and welcome once again to the Power of Reading program here at Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home. And this is Sister Beatrice, your host and presenter during this Power of Reading program. And we continue our journey. This is our fourth program as we continue to serialize a history of the Catholic Church, a book that tells us about 2,000 plus years of the history of the Catholic Church, where we began. Actually, we have made a very long journey together with this book. Already we have dealt with about 5 chapters. We are going to our 6th chapter in a book that has 18 chapters. And we continue with this, our program that introduces to you the important classical latest Catholic books. And in this program, we really want to make sure that we promote the culture of reading, because reading is very important. We know that today we are blessed with the internet, the communications technology, and maybe we might think that reading is old-fashioned, is out of place, but we realize that reading is of extreme importance to all of us in terms of growth, our human growth, but also in our growth of faith. And of course, we realize that the book is still one of the best inventions in the development and the history of the human person. And we also realize there is a way we learn by reading that we may not be able to achieve through the internet, because the reading also involves many of our senses, and also it is healthy for us also to use this tool for reading. And we continue reviewing this book, A History of the Catholic Church, a book written by Father Norbert Bruckmann, who is a Marianist priest, and Father Umberto Pescantini, a Comboni missionary, and revised and updated by Father Stephen Jure, who is a priest from the Catholic Diocese of Eldoret. And actually, this book, I have always reminded you, dear listener, of the different chapters that we have. And I will not tire to do that, because I want you to become very familiar with this book. As we said, chapter 1 deals with the beginnings of the church. Chapter 2, the era of persecutions. Chapter 3, the great test of faith, understanding God, Christ, who can be saved, and the Bible. Chapter 4, the churches of the Nile. Here we talk about Alexandria. We talk about the unity of the church within Egypt, Alexandria itself, but also in areas of Nubia, present-day Sudan, and also Ethiopia, the desert monks. Then we have also chapter 5 that deals with the German immigrations. Chapter 6 that we shall look at today, the conflict with Islam. Chapter 7, Christian life in the Middle Ages. Chapter 8, Age of Unrest. Here we see the whole area of the Byzantines, that is the Eastern Church, the Great Schism, Conciliarism, Renaissance. Chapter 9 deals with divisions in Christianity, and here we deal with the Reformation, the whole area of Martin Luther, John Calvin. Chapter 10 deals with the renewed church, a living faith. Chapter 11 also talks about the new worlds, the discovery of the new worlds and beyond the seas. People started going over the seas, and of course this meant also they had to take Christianity with them. Of course, there was also the spirit of revolution, how the world was also changing, the making of a secular Europe. Chapter 13, chapter 14 deals with the ends of the earth. Now we also discover the Far East. Chapter 15, the New World, New Churches. Chapter 16, the Great Protestant Awakening. Chapter 17, gains and losses that we incurred in the First and Second World Wars, and the results of that was communism and Cold War, and also Christian democracy on the other hand. And chapter 18 actually deals with completing the Counter-Reformation, and this is what happens during the Second Vatican Council. So today we shall begin our journey with chapter 6 that talks about the conflict with Islam. Because remember, at a particular point of our journey, Islam is founded as a religion, and also it has impact on Christianity. So we are going to take our first break, and after this break, we shall come and begin to review chapter 6 of the book that we are reviewing, the book A History of the Catholic Church, here at Radio Maria Nairobi, and the program is The Power of Reading. are listening to Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home, and this is the Power of Reading program. I'm your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul, and let us sit back as we continue our journey with the history of the Catholic Church. Actually, this is our fourth program on this book, a very interesting book, and I hope that most of you who are following me already have a copy of this book. Now, chapter 6 of this book, our authors, Father Norbert and Father Umberto, they present to us the whole area of Islam, and they call this chapter the conflict with Islam. And what these fathers do here is, first of all, they present to us, or they present to the reader, Muhammad and Islam. Of course, they talk about the jihad, which actually was quite extensive at that time. Then, of course, at this point, because of this also conflict, we see the westernization of Christianity. And of course, we see the crusades that are supposed to help to counter the effects of Islam. And of course, we see what we call the La Reconquista, the reconquering, we could say, loosely translating. And this is also a part of the history of our church, because Islam comes along the way and we need to counter it, and it had effects, because we are talking about places like Alexandria. We speak of the home of someone like St. Augustine in Carthage, and these places are actually Muslim now, and we may ask ourselves, how did this come about? Now, the authors tell us that while Christian missionaries labored to bring the tribes of Europe to Christ, a dreadful storm was building up, and out of the barren lands of Arabia swept a power that in less than 100 years conquered 2 continents and a part of a third. It was a new religion, Islam, that provided Christianity with the most serious setback of its history. Arabia in the 6th century was populated by nomadic peoples who worshipped idols and believed in spirits. The main place of worship was Mecca, at a place of pilgrimage called the Kaaba. This contained a huge sacred black stone, probably a meteorite, which the Arabs believed came from God. Over the years, over 300 idols were enshrined around the Kaaba. Then a man who rose against this state of affairs was Muhammad, who was born at Mecca around 570 AD. He was an illiterate trader, and he had a religious experience in which the angel Gabriel spoke to him, "Arise and preach," and moved by the fear of God's judgment, Muhammad totally submitted himself to Allah, the one God. And this was the origin of Islam, which means submission. And Muhammad, at the age of 40, felt himself called by Allah to be his messenger and prophet. And for 10 years, Muhammad preached without response, except opposition of the Meccan traders. And in 622, he and a tiny band of followers fled to Medina. And this exodus, which is called the Hijrah, was so significant that Muslims begin their calendars from 622. Medina welcomed the Prophet, and in 630 he returned to Mecca as a conquering hero and personally supervised the destruction of all the idols. At Muhammad's death 2 years later, all Arabia was Muslim. The basics of Islam are 5. We all know them because we live with our brother and sisters Muslims. The first one is to confess the faith with the formula, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. 2, to pray 5 times daily. 3, to practice charity, giving to the poor. 4, to fast completely during the holy month of Ramadan. 5, to make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in a lifetime. And the teachings of Islam are contained in the Holy Quran, which was collected and committed to writing by Muhammad's successor Uthman. And the Quran is believed to be the literal word of God as revealed to Muhammad. The sayings and practices of the Prophet were recorded in the Hadith. Ijma completed the threefold path by giving the law. Islam incorporated many Jewish and Christian elements and recognized a series of prophets, including Abraham and Jesus, who came before Muhammad. Muhammad is the last prophet in terms of Islamic religion. And actually, Muhammad is the last prophet, which means he is the seal of the prophets. With Christianity, Islam professes immortality of the soul, heaven and hell. It also adopted the practice of circumcision of males and allows polygamy. We know that circumcision of males was common in the Old Testament, beginning with Abraham, and they trace their ancestry also to Abraham. It's a very interesting religion. Then, of course, there is the whole issue of jihad. This is also important for us to understand as part of the history of the Catholic Church. We are not here to explain about the Islamic religion, but it is part of our history. We encountered them, and this is what also our authors are sharing with us here. So this doesn't give us some kind of authority to speak for the Muslims, but we are sharing this from the point of view of our shared history. Now, the authors also present to us the jihad, and Muhammad taught that idol worshippers were to be converted by the sword, but that monotheists for the Jews, this is in the Quran, or I don't know if it's in the Quran or the Hadith, but I am also aware of it. The monotheists, because Islam is a monotheist religion, they believe in one God only, and for them, the monotheists are the Christians, and the Jews could be tolerated because they were also monotheists, though they had to pay special taxes. In fact, jihad, or the spread of Islam, by all means became the fifth pillar of the new faith. Now, jihad is meant to be the spread of Islam. I know that we have a different meaning today to mean a kind of holy war. It also means war even for the Muslims, that when somebody is trying to conquer negative things in their lives, it's also a jihad to oneself. And at first, Islam swooped down on the neighboring areas, conquering and placing them in submission. Militarily, Islam was a tremendous success. Within 100 years, it ruled all of Egypt, Syria, and North Africa, and to the east, all of present Iraq, Iran, Pakistan. This was part of the Byzantine Empire. And the Visigothic Kingdom of Spain fell in less than 6 months. So swift was the Muslim advance. Its move into Western Europe was finally stopped at Tours, France, in 732 by Charles Martel, whose name means Charles the Hammer. And despite Muhammad's teaching, intense pressure was put on Christians to convert, and Muslims used political tensions to their advantage, recruiting among subjected people who sometimes considered them liberators. Since the occupation of Egypt by Justinian, for example, the Christian fellowship between Greek and Copts had collapsed. There was already religious separation over monophysite ideas, but the Copts also considered the Greek Orthodox to be agents of the government. They became known as the Malachites, which means the emperor's men. And many uneducated Coptic people joined the new religion because they were disillusioned by what was happening between the Greeks and the Copts, especially because of the new empire that conquered for a while. But the majority actually remained faithful, and most of the now hated Greeks were evacuated from Alexandria by the Byzantine navy. Gradually, heavy taxes were levied on Christians until some of them could no longer support them. And in several cases, Christians were even taxed to build mosques. And Christians were also required to wear distinctive dress so they could be obvious to all. In this way, the merchant class was eliminated and the people gradually drifted over into Islam. A faithful remnant never abandoned the Coptic Church, however, and has kept the church alive through the centuries. At no time has persecution or prejudice from the Muslim majority been absent. So they had had to live with that for many, many years. And a similar small Christian communities were preserved in Armenia, in Syria, in Persia, under some difficult conditions. And none of these were as large or prominent as the Egyptian Copts, and none has experienced a revival. Now, being nomadic people, the authors here tell us that the Arabs were particularly successful with desert tribes, such as the Berbers in the Maghreb. And here, the missionary failure of the Catholics to evangelize the indigenous people contributed to the end. Christians were limited to Latinized people, and there was no local liturgy as in Egypt. In North Africa, the Muslims had invaded the church that was seriously weakened by centuries of conflict. First by Donaticism, by Arianism. These are heresies that left people exhausted and confused. and the brief revival following Justinian invasion had been cultural as much as religion. And again, the new administration was Greek, not Latin, so North Africa Christianity collapsed very quickly. And the Saracens took Carthage in 698 and completed the conquest of the entire Maghreb in 709. By the 11th century, only 3 dioceses remained of the huge territory that stretched from Libya to the Straits of Gibraltar. Gibraltar is an island in the Mediterranean where once there had been close to 1,000 dioceses. As was mentioned before, the flourishing Christian kingdoms of Ethiopia and Nubia also came under pressure but survived intact for some centuries. Ethiopia, of all the ancient Christian nations, always, for some reason, resisted Islam. For these states, the main effect of Islam was complete separation from the rest of Christianity, because now there was that block of the Muslims between them and the western part of Christianity. So Ethiopia was blocked completely. And actually, at a certain point, Europe even forgot the existence of Christians in Ethiopia and in parts of Egypt. And of course, we know that also for the Muslims in their conquest, they were not totally united. Sometimes dispute arose over the right of succession, and that's what split Islam to what we call the Shia and the Sunni. And the vast Muslim territories had one faith, but they were governed by a series of independent caliphates. Of course, that is a different history, but also it helps us to understand the effect of Islam on Christianity. And of course, this threat to the continuation of Christianity continued for a long time. It was real. It was difficult, and actually we see Constantinople was raided and much of the Eastern Empire was lost before the Muslims were stopped. And Christianity and Islam, for this reason, became traditional enemies, and the military conflicts between them went on for 1,000 years. So also when we are trying to have interreligious dialogue with Islam today, we have to realize that we have 1,000-year history of conflict. That does not mean that we are not making a lot of headway, which I believe will continue to move further and further ahead. But we have a long, long history of conflict. And the face of Christianity was changed by Muslim conflicts. And before, there were 4 patriarchates. Remember, we had 4 patriarchates, but now 3 were not there anymore. And Alexandria was fighting for its life after the invasion. Antioch, founded by Apostle Peter, was similarly under the same siege. Jerusalem was almost non-existent. Only Rome survived intact, still expanding, and now the undisputed center of Christian life. So also this helps us to understand how we ended up with having Rome as the center of the Catholic Church. Why not Alexandria? Why not Jerusalem? Why not Antioch? So these are the situations that the early church found itself. This is history. We cannot change it, and God allowed it for a reason. And by the 10th century, when everything was a bit in a decline in terms of Christianity, we see that there was a new nation that was called Guz. It split into 2 clans, a pagan one and a Muslim one. And this invaded Persia, and this also created its own situation. And of course, Byzantine was annihilated and Jerusalem was seized. And of course, this brought forth the whole issue of the Crusades that were meant to bring back the lost land. And this is also where we see a bit of a challenge in terms of the church remaining united. And we see that there was this new vigor also from the Christians wanting to go and reclaim their land. And there was what we call the reconquering. And we see Europe fighting back to get what we call the Iberian Peninsula, that is Spain and Portugal, which Muslims had occupied. And now we see this kind of trying to get back what the Christians had lost. Of course, this brought a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of confusion. But we see that by 1492, Spain was able to conquer even the last part where there was the Muslim invasion in Grenada. And these are things that also changed the whole ideas. And in this movement also we know that that's when we have people like Christopher Columbus moving out. Let us take a break. I would want us also to move on to something else that is slightly different from this whole story of Islam. I would want us to look at chapter 7 of this book that deals with Christian life in the Middle Ages, because it's also important, besides knowing who conquered who and why and what happened. We had a lot of situations that affected Christianity. Either they were cultural, political, or religious. But what was happening actually to Christianity? What were the effects on Christianity at this time? So we take a break. You are listening to Radio Maria Nairobi, and this is the Power of Reading program. And we shall come back to continue to review the book, A History of the Catholic Church. You are listening to the Power of Reading program here at Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home. And I am your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul. We continue serializing the book, A History of the Catholic Church, the book that talks about the history of the church as it is. This is written by historians. Of course, there are a lot of faith issues in it, but mainly is to give us a kind of a correct account and informed account of how our church has grown. We have just passed through the whole area of Islam, the invasion of Islam, and what happened is something that is important for us also to read, to understand how our patriarchates fell, the Patriarchate of Alexandria, of Antioch, of Constantinople, and we remained only with Rome, that eventually became the center of our Christian faith. Now, what about the Christian life in the Middle Ages? And this, we are talking about the time when the Roman Empire fell. Now, when the Roman Empire fell, it was very, very organized. So we see that its systematic organization into dioceses and provinces went with it. It fell with it. And the church continued to use these terms, but the socio and political system that evolved was now known as feudalism. So in the last days of the empire, taxes became extreme, and the peasants actually ended up placing themselves under the protection of local, the authors call them petty nobles, some people who had some type of nobility, and people because the taxes were a lot. Remember, the Romans based their governance not mainly in enslaving the people, but allowing the people to continue with their everyday work, and the people are supposed to pay taxes to Caesar. It's almost like what happens today, and that's why we have always to fight to say, okay, the taxes should not be so overbearing that the people cannot live, and also these taxes should go also to develop the people, to develop the country. So you see that at this time, as the Roman Empire was falling, the taxes were so high, and the peasants, the poorer people, to avoid paying taxes, gave their lands to noblemen who in turn guaranteed protection. And a peasant could not leave his land, but he was not owned by the noble like a slave. This system of being bound to the land was called serfdom. As security conditions deteriorated with the arrival of the barbarians, it provided the only means by which the peasants could protect themselves. And this crude social system developed into later centuries into a complex series of layers of mutual obligations. Everyone knew their places in such a society, and only rarely could anyone escape the level into which they were born. So the landowner soon found that he too needed protection, not to mention a means of marketing surplus crops, acquiring skilled craftsmen. Just as the peasant, he allied himself again to a higher person. So you see, there's a hierarchy of everyone aligning themselves to somebody else. And each one thereby became a liege, the one below him, and a subordinate to those above. So somebody had power on someone else, but you're subordinate to somebody on top. Naturally, the peasants were at the bottom. And the peasant was a tenant farmer and could turn to his liege for seeds and fertilizer and help in getting tools. His family had to be provided with a hut and a garden plot. All he grew was provided with the liege. He paid no taxes in money, but he had to give some days every year for road maintenance, bridge building, or direct service to whom they aligned themselves. And in case the person to whom they aligned themselves, the liege, in turn provided security, which might be a fort in time of attack or a small military force of knights. And he also was a court of justice if there were disputes among the peasants. He arranged weddings, decided which ones would learn trades such as blacksmithing, and generally that person, their lord, was the government. And the liege was at the lowest level was probably a knight himself or a small landowner. His superior, however, was likely to be a member of a nobility with a number of subordinate knights, lords of the manor, or other under him. And this nobleman in turn owed allegiance. This man owed allegiance to the duke or to a high noble of the region, who in turn was bound to the king. And the knights and nobility gave service to their lieges by providing soldiers, usually themselves and the men of their households, in time of defense. So there was this life, the Christian life in the Middle Ages. Now, what did this do to the church in this state of affairs? At the lowest level, it provided parish priests chosen from among the peasants and educated by local clergymen, then appointed with the approval of the liege. And it was not unusual for this priest to remain in the same place for his entire life. And in the Middle Ages, he would be married and have a small plot to support himself and the family. At the next level, church institutions commonly served as the local government, that is, bishops, monasteries, especially the monasteries owned land, provided security and held the same position. And an abbot, therefore, could be a person of considerable importance, controlling serfs and lands, which were a major source of church income. And in some noble families, it became customary to have their firstborn son inherit the title, while a later born was given to the church to become an abbot or prior. So this is how the Christian life evolved in terms of being connected to the social life. So social life also is very, very important in deciding how people are able to live their faith. And religious figures could not be the highest levels of feudal system. There was one exception in Germany where the Teutonic Knights, a military order, governed its own nation for several centuries. Also, in number of cases, very important dioceses became independent, like free states, and were governed by prince bishops, and these were quite common in Germany and Austria, but rare elsewhere. So you see also now where the church becomes ingrained in the life of the people, sometimes also for negative situation. And of course, we see the propriety of the church system. This was a system that went hand in hand with feudalism. According to this system, the parish church, with its property and revenues, was owned by a specific person acting in the name of the patron saint to that church. So when you read church history, sometimes or even you see some movies that depict this kind of abuses also within the church, they were there. And so the Christian church also suffered a lot, having poorly educated priests. And that's why even later, if you read the history of the church, you find the rise of great men who wanted to change this status quo. Now, the Christian life, by the time of the Crusades, we see that places like Scandinavia, Poland, Hungary were Catholic, but in everyday religion, it touched everything from birth through marriage to death. And also by 1300, the present-day doctrine of the church on the seventh sacrament was defined. Adult baptism with its long preparation became very rare. Remember, in the early church, there was a long preparation for baptism. Now people are baptized as infants. It became the standard. And also this was because also there was a very high infant mortality. And there was also the private confession of sins promoted by the Celtic monks, and this replaced public confessions every year. The Eucharist was the center of Christian life, and there was an ancient custom of weekly mass disappeared, and most priests began celebrating every day. When people died, they often left sums of money to ensure that masses would be said for their souls, and so they were chantry or singing priests who celebrated many masses daily for the dead. And the Western Church also began keeping consecrated hosts in the tabernacle for adoration. And previously, the Eastern custom had been observed where only a few hosts, if any, were kept for the dying. Medieval Christians, however, developed the elaborate cult of the body of Christ. And this led to such customs as having the priest, right after the consecration of the host, hold the host to be adored. Around this time, a service, benediction, was developed for blessing the people with the host in a special holder. And great artwork went into these monstrances using precious metals and jewels. Both masses and benediction were celebrated with great pomp and splendor, even in simple churches. So we see also this growth of the Christian church around the piety. There was also this ancient devotion to the relic of the martyrs, places of pilgrimage where people would go to reconnect to the faith. There were hundreds of local pilgrimage places in Europe, usually a national one as well. For example, in England, there was one in Canterbury. Of course, Rome was a big place of pilgrimage where the apostles Peter and Paul were buried. Santiago in Spain, the tomb of St. James the apostle, and also Jerusalem with the holy places of Jesus. And a system of hotels and way stations were set up along the main pilgrimage routes to care for the travelers. Military orders provided security against bandits and thieves. Shrines also attracted corrupt men who exploited the simple faith of pilgrims for material gains. And so judges even became assigned for pilgrimages to punish crimes that may have happened along the way. And we see that other popular devotions began in the Middle Ages, and some of these are still going on until today. We have the devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. It was there since the early church, but it became very, very strong. And every cathedral had a lady chapel in her honor, and even the smallest village church had a statue. And the wearing of what we call the Marian scapulars also began at this time. Also, the authors here of our book, A History of the Catholic Church, present to us the cathedrals. This is also a very important thing because we see while this activity of the cathedrals was taking place, another was shaping the appearance of medieval Europe. People began erecting majestic cathedrals to the honor of God. And in the 11th century, the Romanesque style developed, replacing churches that had fire hazards like wooden roofs with what we would call the Romanesque church, which was massive and it was solid stone, resting its weight on thick walls and large pillars because stone roofs were so heavy. There were few windows. While this produced a sense of solemnity, it was also dark. The church builders compensated with lavish decorations, including paintings and lively tapestries in bright colors. Side chapels with statues lit by candles were grouped along the aisles. Over 1,500 of these churches were built in France alone. Actually, one of the tourism thing that happens in Europe is to go and see these very magnificent, exquisite churches where you find they are so huge and actually so tastefully decorated in terms of paintings, ornamentation, and things like that. And about a century later, actually, after this Roman style, they began an inspiration of a generation of architects who understood principles of physics better. And they discovered that if stone supports were placed along the outside, the walls could be much thinner and large windows would be possible. And this is a style which is called the Gothic style and became extremely popular. People gladly volunteered to participate in construction, and even small towns could boast magnificent Gothic churches. Some were large enough to contain the entire population of a place. And over 80 French cathedrals were built in Gothic style in this period, along with hundreds of other churches. They were matters of great pride and admiration and were often built in competition with one another. Actually, this is very, very interesting history to read about the cathedrals. And the Gothic church was full of light, and therefore decoration was much less necessary. The pillars were very high and often intricately carved. The doors were sculptured. The windows gave scope to glass makers who produced stunning artworks in stained glass, illustrating scenes from the Bible or the lives of the saints. And the Romanesque church had symbolized solidity, while the soaring Gothic caused people to look up, symbolized reaching for heaven. And Gothic engineering made it possible to build very tall structures. The Gothic style has been called a symphony in stone because of its sense of harmony. Other forms of art were also given impetus by Christianity during the Middle Ages. Music naturally centered around the liturgy, and the free-form Gregorian chant developed to a very high degree. The Gregorian chant, the famous Gregorian chant, was developed during the Middle Ages. Drama was deliberately written to counter pagan plays that were still popular. And at first, the Christian dramas were performed in churches because they were about Bible stories and they were called mysteries. Gradually, they were moved to the entrance of the church and then on to traveling stages. So that's all that we had for you today. Please make sure that if until now, this is our fourth program, you have not gotten this book, make sure you get yourself a copy in any of the Catholic bookshops, or you can get a copy in any of the Pauline bookshops. You can also visit us online on www.paulinesafrica.org, and you can be able to buy your book and it can be shipped to you, because this book is of great importance to understand the history of the Catholic Church. And we also encourage you to continue reading, and in case you are not able to follow our program today, you can also be able to visit Radio Maria website page and be able to get the podcast there. So thank you very much, dear listeners, for being with us. We also thank Mr. Timothy Moredi, our technician, who has recorded this program for us here at Pauline's Studio, Nairobi. We thank him and we hope to meet next week. Continue listening to the programming of Radio Maria. I have been your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul. Thank you and may God bless you.
You have been listening to the Power of Reading program. Join us next week as we continue discovering the wonderful world of books. This program is prepared for Radio Maria Nairobi and presented to you by the Daughters of St. Paul.